1932, it leapt to 24%. So 1 out of 4 people was out of work. And so one of the things that, there's no social, well, some states have unemployment insurance. I have to correct that. But the social network, the safety network, is predicated on a few people at any given time are going to have trouble. And so you just have set aside, the society as a whole needs to set aside a little bit to help them. And much of the effort to help people had to come from private organizations, including, in this case, the American Legion, which set up an employment bureau to help people find jobs, and churches, charities, philanthropic organizations. Now, this employment bureau happened to be in Los Angeles, California. In fact, California was counter-cyclical. Well, the eastern part of the country was going into increasingly severe economic situations. California remained flat and then started improving. The issue, of course, California was not exempt from the deflation problem, so from your money being worth less. And it was also not exempt from the problems caused by lack of certainty. And it was not exempt from the problems caused by the shutdown of global trade, which we'll get to. Of course, there were also state unemployment offices. But, and initially the idea was, well, we'll find jobs for people. Maybe they have to work for a little less. The system will adjust itself. But if more and more companies are shutting down because they can't pay their debt burden, then, the opportunities for new employment are decreasing. The charitable organizations, the philanthropic organizations, had a historic practice of only wanting to give aid to the deserving needy. So in order to get aid, if you had lost your job, if everyone in your family had lost your job, you had to go through an interview process that was not just simply about whether you had worked hard enough for the previous years, but also probed into your family life, into your morals and the morals of people in your family. It was, for many people, considered a degrading experience, as this painting is trying to convey. But for increasing numbers of people, there was no way to survive unless you got some food, at least. And then people who were unemployed started organizing unemployed councils and demonstrating, demanding that the government do something more effective than what Hoover had done. And much of this was built up to what was called the Bonus March, which was veterans from World War I marched on, unemployed veterans from World War I, marched on Washington, D.C., and set up an encampment demanding that Congress pass legislation which would give all veterans a bonus. The rationale for this was the veterans with this bonus would spend it on basic necessities, thus stimulating the economy. That if people were afraid to spend money, there had to be influxes of money into the economy. So this was one of the most prominent ideas, is the government owed World War I veterans a hell of a lot. Let's give them a monthly stipend, whether they're employed or unemployed, and they can go out and spend it on something, and that will keep the economy moving. There was also what was called the ham and eggs movement, which was the idea that every senior citizen, everyone over the age of 60, would get $250 a month. And they had to spend it. The money would be expired. It was going to be special money that was worthless at the end of the month. So you had $250 to spend every month. Both of these ideas, the ham and eggs movement, so seniors wouldn't be going hungry, they'd be able to buy ham and eggs, and the bonus movement were shot down because many people felt it was immoral, that you had to make a distinction between the deserving needy and the undeserving needy. Even if it would be good for the economy, which almost everybody had agreed it would be bad for the morale of the country, for the moral life of the country. So after the bonus march, Hoover asked Douglas MacArthur, who was the head of the military in the Washington, D.C. area, to disperse the bonus marchers. Hoover insisted that there be no violence, but MacArthur did it his own way, and there were a number of people killed in the process of dispersing the veterans. At the time, many people said that Hoover had lost any possibility for re-election because of what happened with the bonus march, but likely he had lost any. By this time, he was already a cooked goose. Now, the geography of the Depression. If you look, the black lines are the areas of North America that were most heavily hit, with the deepest poverty, the highest unemployment rates, the greatest levels of loss of property. The red lines are the areas that prospered during the Depression. So if you look, you can see it's Washington, the state of Washington, Northeast Oregon, most of California, or at least where people live, and South Texas and Louisiana. And actually a little bit of Michigan and Ohio. So it's not simply a Rust Belt phenomena. The prosperity, which has to be understood as modest, was nonetheless, there was sections of the country which maintained 1920s level of standard of living and perhaps even better, while there were other sections of the country which were going into deeper poverty. Now, when I say the unemployment in 1932 was at 24%. That's a national average. In fact, probably only a few places had 24% unemployment. Some places like California would have 8%. Other places like Western Pennsylvania might have 50 or 60%. So the effects of the Depression were uneven, which caused, certainly promoted labor migrations. People in particular coming to the West because it was reported in the news about how basically things were okay in California, the land of milk and honey, and oranges grow, fresh fruit grows everywhere, as the woman in the video said. But if we look at the distinction of where things were relatively prospering, the distinction boils down, there are a lot of complex factors going on, but in California, Washington, Oregon, and Michigan, and Northwest Ohio, essentially you had places with relatively new industrial investment. These are areas that did not have a lot of need for infrastructure investments or for recapitalization. The areas most heavily hit were areas where industrialization had occurred in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, where The infrastructure, the capital investment was aging and no longer adequate, and where the infrastructure was basically bad. In the United States, by the 1920s, the cost of transporting goods was half of what it was in France. Why was that? Because France delayed building its roads until much later. And so they built modern, good modern roads after World War I, and they were able to move their products to market much more efficiently. They were able to develop a trucking system to complement their train system. The United States had no national highway system, and it had an aging set of railroads. So the costs of transportation were quite high compared to most of the competitor countries. This was something that Herbert Hoover had been very acutely aware of when he was Secretary of Commerce. And one of his triumphs as Secretary of Commerce in 1926 was to come up with a national transportation plan, which was to renew the railroad stock and then to build a national highway system. The planning for this began in 1927, implementation began in 1928, and it was pretty much finished by 1940. It took basically 14 years to implement this plan that was adopted in 1926, and by 1940, the United States had the most modern, up-to-date transportation system in the world. To some degree, the transportation system we have now is probably early 1960s. So we, to some degree, are facing a similar problem where our contemporary transportation system is backwards compared to most other places. That was one of the major structural problems underlying the Great Depression, was the aging character of much of the industrial investment and of national infrastructure. Those areas where industrial investment was newer, Michigan auto industry really expands and becomes what the major industry in the 1920s, so that plant was new. California and Washington were new sites for industrial development, 1920s, and continuing in the 1930s with the development of aviation. South Texas and Louisiana, that's petroleum. The development of a new source of energy. But of course the Depression was not simply a United States phenomenon, though in the rest of the world it was always referred to as the American Depression instead of the Great Depression. The Depression, in fact, hit Europe much harder than it hit the United States when it spread to Europe at the end of 1930. For the first year after the stock market crash, Europe seemed to be exempt from the economic problems that the United States had. And then at the end of 1930, it was like the plug was pulled. And in country after country, there was significant economic problems. France is one of the countries with the least set of problems during